Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the best show of the best shows, where we talk about everything from comic books to even social commentary. This is episode number
10
of For Canon's Sake. So whether you're a normie, a wannabe expert, or a tryhard, get in there. And now, for your host, Mr. Eric July.
Of course, this episode of For Canon's Sake is going to be something special. Have a guy I'm really cool with, man, big patron of mine as well. He was a supporter, and it was a must, obviously, to get him on the show because he has a lot of good insight on a lot of different things that, you see me talk about, certainly regarding, just libertarianism or liberty, economics, and things like that. But today I'm joined by brother man Jose Nino. Man, how are you doing, brother?
I'm doing great, Eric. You?
Man, I'm doing well. Just got through working out, so I'm feeling good. And again, I'm glad we can finally get you here, man. And it's much love, 100%. So the first thing I want to get into, I want you to introduce yourself, certainly for the audience. Let them know of your background and sort of where you're coming from in terms of your knowledge. You're sort of a Venezuelan American. You come from that background, so you do have some insight on what's going on out there. But just let the audience that may be unfamiliar with you in on, what it is that you're about.
Well, I was born in Venezuela, and I came to the States relatively young, like late 90s, and it's like a time whenever like my parents, especially my dad, his business went under, and they kind of saw the writing on the wall about how things were about to jump off in Venezuela. Like to just give you an example, like in 1996, when like my dad closed down his business, like inflation was like 100%, and Hugo Chavez was not even in office then. So things were like kind of going bad, and my parents were like, we might need to like look for greener pastures for both for our kids' future and just go from there. So I come to the States when I was relatively young. I lived in the DFW area for most of my life. I got into this whole movement really through like Ron Paul and other figures like Alex Jones, especially like in 2007. It's when I got pretty active, and I've been active in a lot of like college groups over the years. And then over the past 3 years, I've worked like in like gun lobbying, specifically like with regards to like email marketing and copywriting, but I've also gotten like some legislative experience as well. So I've been in the trenches and have seen a lot of like really crazy stuff on both sides of the political spectrum. Okay. To give you an idea about that. And that's given me like a lot of good firsthand experience about how politics works and how not everything you see in the media is like what it seems. And now I work as a freelance writer, and I've got my own website and like 2 ebooks, one on gun control and another on Venezuela. And I'm just doing a lot of content creating, and also I write for Mises and other organizations as well.
Right. Yep. And I've seen all that. It's good work. Certainly. And I want to dive into something that you just dove into, obviously, with Venezuela. If you don't mind, just give everybody certainly your take. We know that they're in sort of this economic sort of turmoil. It seems like the inevitable when we talk about socialism, but specifically with you having that background, it's a little more closer to home with you. I would love your thoughts on what's going on, and even if there is any sort of solution to getting them back on track, because it is sort of odd to have those sort of natural resources and to still be able to be in this amount of economic trouble is certainly telling on how dangerous socialism is. But certainly, what is your take on it all?
Well, I have one of the more unique takes on this whole Venezuelan crisis, because in my ebook, How Socialism Destroyed Venezuela, I explain how this process of its like deterioration is really 50 years in the making. You have to go back actually when Venezuela returned to democracy in 1958. to really understand the overall context of its complete like economic collapse. Give you a brief summary of how Venezuela used to be like very rich. The Venezuelan state was very small actually from the 1910s up until the 1970s. It had very low taxation, very low regulation. In fact, it didn't have central banking until the 1930s, 1939 specifically. So this allowed the country to become very rich quickly, especially with the oil discovery as well. And it attracted a lot of very skilled immigrant labor from Italy, Spain, Portugal, Lebanese Christians, Syrian Christians, and even Colombians. And by the 1950s, Venezuela was one of the richest countries in the world, richer than most European countries. Some estimates put it in the top 10 richest countries on a per capita GDP basis. Ironically enough, Venezuela, in its most economically prosperous times, it not only had low oil prices on a historical basis, but it also was under military dictatorships. It was not really under democratic rule. But once it went under democratic rule from like 1958 to 1998, the country started stagnating because the bipartisan political order there was very social democratic in nature, and they started experimenting with gradualist forms of socialism where they didn't go like all in with their legislation, but they had like a long-term vision of having tremendous state control over the economy. And they achieved a major victory in the 1970s when they nationalized the oil industry. This runs counter to a lot of mainstream conservative talking points that they say that Hugo Chavez nationalized the oil industry. It was nationalized well before he came into power, but I'll touch on that later. Well, with this nationalization of the oil industry, it fundamentally changed the nature of the Venezuelan state and the economy, and also civil society too. So what happened was that now Venezuelan politicians and bureaucrats had a massive piggy bank of oil revenue they could use to subsidize industries, to buy votes, to provide these lavish social welfare programs. And this nationalization coincided as well with the government buying a majority stake in the central bank. So now their central bank was completely politicized. And with all these levers under their control, the Venezuelan government went on a massive spending binge through the 70s and 80s. Eventually, it came to an end in 1983 whenever the government had to undergo the most significant devaluation of its national currency, the Bolivar. And from that point forward, the 1980s to the 90s was like a lost decade for Venezuela. Venezuelans actually started to get poor then. And in the early 90s, you had a guy named Carlos Andres Perez, who ironically nationalized the oil industry in the 1970s, win a second term to the presidency. He campaigned on returning to the same bonanza and all of that. Unfortunately, when he came into power, he realized the Venezuelan state was bankrupt and all this, and that like it was very uncompetitive at an international scale. So they turned to the IMF for help.
Oh God.
The IMF, like ironically at that time, because you had a lot of like the Friedmanite ideas gain some relevance, they had like some decent reforms for Venezuela, but it was a really mixed bag because Venezuela did reduce some subsidies and some tariffs and stuff like that, but they never really privatized the oil industry, and they never tamed inflation. So what happened was whenever Carlos Andres Perez announced his package of reforms, people just started rioting and stuff because the inflation was so high. I believe it was close to like 80, 90%. This was like 1989. But people really could not bear any of the economic reforms because the inflation was just eating away at their savings. So the government actually had its own like Tiananmen Square incident where they cracked down on a lot of protests and it got really violent. A lot of the protesters, unfortunately, were total socialists and communists protesting because they thought the government wasn't going far enough. And ironically, Carlos Inés Perez, his party, Acción Democrática, is part of Socialist International. And they were also opposed to a lot of his reforms because they thought they were too capitalist. And that's what ultimately led to his undoing. Perez was impeached in 1994 for embezzlement charges by his own party, ironically enough. In this time frame, in 1992, you had a lieutenant colonel by the name of Hugo Chavez launched 2 unsuccessful coups against the Venezuelan government. And although they were failures, the entire political system just fell apart then. Both the two parties, the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, Acción Democrática, were completely discredited. And eventually, like, some centrist candidate came in and tried to piece things together, but they really just kicked the can down the road. And Hugo Chavez was pardoned in 1996. And to give you some perspective, in 1998, the average Venezuelan was poorer than the average Venezuelan in 1958, the year that Venezuela returned to democracy. It was categorized by Charles Jones of Intro to Economic Growth as a economic growth disaster. The only countries that held that role were Nicaragua, a socialist country that had a literal civil war throughout the 1970s up until the late 80s, and several sub-Saharan African countries. Every other country, Western country, or of comparable socioeconomic standing as Venezuela, had growth in this period, in this 40-year period. And even in Latin America, most countries, as screwed up as some were at that time, still had economic growth. So Venezuela was supposed to be a first world country, but they completely blew it. So when you have those factors in consideration, Chavez had a ripe environment for the taking. He actually campaigned as a centrist, blaming the previous political order for crony capitalism, corruption, and all of that. And a lot of people gravitated towards that. It was very popular because there were a lot of poor people now in the urban centers. Unfortunately, when he came into office, he not only continued the same policies, but he doubled down like completely. And that's why we see Venezuela the way it is now. Maduro is basically continuing the same policies that Chavez did. And really, what we've seen in the past 60 years of Venezuelan history, we have not seen a genuine attempt by either side of the political aisle trying to go towards market reforms. And even to this day, if you look at the opposition, and this is what I talk about in my book, the overwhelming majority of the opposition, save for a leader named Maria Corina Machado, they're socialist in policies and also affiliation, because if you look at the leaders like Juan Guaido or Leopoldo Lopez of the Voluntad Popular Party, which stands for Popular Will Spanish, they are part of Socialist International. They are the children of the bipartisan order of Venezuela from 1958 to 1998 that stagnated the country. So essentially, you don't have much of a choice there. You have basically a Bolshevik versus Menshevik.
It's funny that you said that, because that was actually the thing that I was going to bring up. That is sounding a lot similar to what went down in Russia. And again, that's insight that I don't think a lot of people know, that the people, like as you're saying, that even tend to be in opposition to the current class is. They're also on the same side, essentially, and socialists. They just may be branding themselves a little differently, but it's still socialist and socialism, which unfortunately, that seems to be the worst thing, the worst possible thing that can happen with that country if they are going to seemingly move forward. They don't really. I mean, at that case, would you agree that they don't even really have a legitimate, let's say, or more so a powerful, or with anybody with power that is trying to implement, or maybe lack thereof, maybe, and we're talking markets, we're talking about getting rid of things, but ideally implement, let's say, the actual, let's say, remedy for what's going on in Venezuela.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at, well, here's another caveat too. Venezuela is a petro state, so right. Its government controls the oil industry, so it completely changes the incentives for how political change is going to emerge there. The opposition, especially a lot of these opposition leaders, they've got their hands in the petro state cookie jar. They get a lot of money from that, and they depend on it. That's why there's institutional reasons why they won't rock the boat and offer a capitalist alternative, because a lot of the opposition there benefits tremendously. And in fact, a lot of them are basically former Chavistas, like supporters of Chavez, that basically think Nicolás Maduro is not real socialism, or he's just corrupt. There's a segment of the population that just jumped ship to the opposition like that. And in Venezuela, the big problem in Venezuela, I think, is cultural at the end of the day, because it's a culture that really does not think in the long term anymore. Mm-hmm. I the petrostate and the socialist policies of the last few decades for that. So it's infected every political party, with the exception of Vente Venezuela, Maria Corina Machado's party. She's not libertarian, but she is centrist enough that her policies, I think, can get Venezuela out of this mess. But she's completely pushed out of the side, not only by the government, but also by the opposition itself. And it's a cultural thing. Now, this person is not a political figure per se. He's a YouTuber, actually. He's a paleo-conservative, Ron Paul supporting Venezuelan named John Patrick Aquaviva. Okay. He actually lives in London now, and he's been featured on InfoWars. He's actually very solid in all the issues. He understands what's going on there in Venezuela, and knows that even a U.S. intervention won't help it at all, because here's the thing that many of the neocons, conservative Inc., or your typical boomer conservative you see on Twitter are not telling you about Venezuela, is that its opposition is also socialist. So one way or the other, you're going to be subsidizing or propping up socialists through an American intervention. And that's what I go in detail about in my book, because that situation there is just so explosive. And I think a intervention would be an absolutely stupid idea. And we're already overstretched as it is when you look at all the military bases and foreign policy adventures the U.S. has gone on over the past few decades. It's just it's a mess. It's a complete mess. And I think doing something in Venezuela would be the absolute height of stupidity and could possibly accelerate a massive fiscal collapse in the U.S. as well. So, yeah.
No, most definitely. Man, and again, that's such an unfortunate situation. Certainly when you get guys that claim to be against the people that they think cause the issues, but they're also wanting to implement some of, some policies that are, since in a lot of cases they double down on what the problem actually is, and they don't really resolve anything. And I think quite often cases, even in America, we're getting some of that. And I want to kind of segue into that when you get, and I would love your thoughts on this, because, you know where I'm at with some of these conservatives in terms of gun rights. And I know with your background and your experience, you'll have some more insight, even more than I do, because, you went into the whole gun lobby thing, in which you have the mainstream Democrat, the mainstream leftist, who is, of course, an advocate of all sorts of gun control, gun bans, and so forth. And then you get, instead of the conservatives taking the mainstream conservatives taking the hardcore, okay, we want to abolish laws. We want to get rid of laws. We want to actually free them up, make guns easier to purchase. They tend to, and this is my plex with some of the folks over at the NRA, in which they will compromise with them, thinking that it's going to shut them up. And then again, they make excuses, and they'll say things like, well, and I get this all the time. They'll say things like, well, they're just trying to, shut them up going into midterms or going into the new election. And I'm like, when has any sort of compromise ever stopped the mainstream leftists from advocating for more gun laws? No, nobody's looked at a bump stock ban or a new red flag law or any sort of I know Trump is sort of pondering the idea of possibly further regulation and ban on suppressors. Like, what in the world? Again, what you have in that experience, I want you to let us in on that. Why do you think that they have that position? And should any legitimate person of gun rights, a person that wants gun ownership, an advocate of further gun rights, be backing the conservatives or maybe mainstream gun enthusiasts and the NRA if they are going to just compromise when it's all said and done?
Well, okay, just give some background. I used to work with National Association for Gun Rights, which is a 100% no compromise gun lobby. They're as libertarian as it gets on the issue, along with Gun Owners of America.
Right.
So, yeah, you obviously see the anti-gun left, like they're openly anti-gun on every issue. In fact, it's kind of scary now. You're starting to hear like a lot of normie leftists openly say now that we should repeal the Second Amendment. Like you're hearing that now. That was almost unheard of like 10 years ago. Like even pro-gun control Democrats back then were like, I support the Second Amendment, but we need this common sense X regulation, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's kind of starting to change now. They've also changed their marketing through like gun safety and stuff like that. But yeah, the mainstream right on this issue has left a lot to be desired, especially in more urbanized red states like say, for example, Texas. We've done a lot of work on the issue, and even Florida, which saw a Republican governor sign bump stock bans and a red flag bill into law. And here's the thing, man. The left is absolutely relentless when it comes to government control. Mm-hmm. That is a given. They will go incrementalist, gradualist, and sometimes even take the whole foot if given the opportunity. So what this means is it's just basic math. If you give them any type of opportunity to get to use the state to abuse people's rights, they're going to take full advantage of it. That's why bump stock bans, red flag laws, and all that stuff, these are no-goes. And with the bump stock ban, here's the really nasty part about it. It was done through like the Justice Department and ATF. It was done for a complete bureaucracy. Yeah. With a law, you can at least pin a representative that sponsored that bill, that terrible bill, and the co-sponsors, and whack them during primaries or during the general election for their shitty votes. But with a bureaucratic mandate, dude, when was the last time that you've seen a bureaucrat ever get removed from office, let alone through an election? Never. And so, yeah, you have like a very weak right, to be honest, on the issue. That being said, there's definitely a lot of promise at the state and local level. For example, at the state level, you see now a lot of states passing constitutional carry. Mm-hmm. This is a trend Yeah, for those that don't know what constitutional carry is, it's just the ability for any law-abiding person to carry a firearm without a permit or without having to beg the government for permission to exercise your supposed right to self-defense. Well, you see this a lot in rural states, in the rural red states, like, say, for example, South Dakota, Oklahoma, Kentucky. They've passed these laws recently, and Arizona was like the first, was one of the first states in the past few decades to get the ball rolling again. Some of the original states that started constitutional carry were Vermont and Alaska, but first state to really get the ball rolling. It's the most urbanized of the constitutional carry states, along with Missouri. But it's really a rural trend, because if you look at a lot of like Pew Research data, it shows that I think well over 60% of rural people, like in areas like those, they support gun rights and support expanding it. But when you start going into more suburbanized or even urbanized red states, say like Texas, Georgia, and Florida, you're going to see a lot of boomer conservatism there. Also, really strong law enforcement lobbies that don't like the issue. You will be hard pressed to find a police chief in a suburban or large urban center, for that matter, that is actually in favor of expanding gun rights. They completely hate that stuff. So you see a lot of that. You see a lot of really just weak defense of gun rights that's only about playing defense, when you're up against an opponent in the left that is playing relentless offense. It's just like a football game where you have a really good defense against a really good offense. Eventually, that really good offense will put points on the board, and if you can't mount an offense against it in retaliation, you're going to lose. It's basic numbers.
Yeah. No, that's exactly how it happens. And this is why, again, I get a little frustrated, or a lot of frustrated, when I see those compromises, because, again, I know that we get to the point of no return, because they're not going to budge on it. And that is an approach that you have, I guess, with somebody that, maybe is sensible on the issue, but they're not. You know what I mean? Like, these guys, like you said, they have no problem talking about, getting rid of amendments, getting rid of any sort of legitimate gun. They always point to other countries, and hey, they banned guns. Why can't we? And sorts of craziness. So I get so frustrated when people compromise, as if that is going to get them to shut up issue, because it never does. Which leads me into the next thing, because you brought up a very good point. And let's say, police chiefs and how they approach things. I believe one of my more controversial positions is, certainly among a lot of the boomer conservatives, is how I recognize the role that law enforcement, as well as public educrats and educators, but specifically in this regards, law enforcement, how they play a role in that, and essentially they are the teeth of the state. But when it comes to laws like that, we have a case out there in Baltimore, which I've covered on my YouTube. I've wrote about it and so forth, in which they were enforcing a red flag law. And of course, the guy tried to defend himself, and ultimately the police ended up shooting him dead. So a lot of boomer conservatives act as if, well, if it comes down to that, well, the cops, they wouldn't dare, military as well, they wouldn't dare enforce these laws. And I don't believe that. And I want your insight on that. I certainly don't believe that. I think there may be cases there where individual, maybe police officers, will maybe quit. But I think the vast majority of them, and this is just my honest opinion, would, just go and enforce those gun laws. What do you think about it?
Well, yeah, this topic is nuanced, but I actually tend to agree with you and a lot of other libertarians that are skeptical of law enforcement, because of how much law enforcement in the U.S. has become de facto federalized. They get a lot of grants and stuff from the federal government. So it's these law enforcement departments are, in effect, politicized. Well, right now I'm living in Colorado, the Fort Collins area specifically. There's a county right next to me called Weld County. Their sheriff, who's a complete outlier in this trend, actually is refusing to enforce Colorado's current red flag law, which passed a few months ago. He is pretty solid on the issue, but the thing about Weld County is this county, it's a rural county. These rural areas, their law enforcement isn't really enforcing much of anything there. There's not just many people there. You don't have all the excuses that the government needs to try to create problems or solve problems, if you will. But it's really more of the exception rather than the rule. And it's also part of a larger trend that's going on in the U.S. where suburbs and urban centers are just turning into complete shit magnets for leftist ideas and all this really dumb SJW white guilt culture. It's just like, it's not looking good. Yeah, a lot of conservatives have to be really careful because a lot of these police lobbies, you could support maybe individual police police officers and whatnot, but when you look at them at the institutional level, especially the higher ups and those in like big urban centers, they're not down with the Second Amendment. They like absolutely despise it. They prefer that only like police and other government functionaries have firearms. Also, I would add here too, because I think that this is important in today's context as well, because we are in a cultural and socioeconomic type of conflict that we've really never seen before. Mm-hmm. Another huge opponent to gun rights are corporations, especially
absolutely
big tech and a lot of banks through all this deplatforming and debanking. So we're in a different environment now, and people are going to have to adapt because the traditional model of just like leftist activists with waving signs in front of the Capitol pushing for gun control, that's just not how it's working now. You're seeing them doing a full court press in the culture, in the boardroom, obviously through traditional lobbying, but it's becoming more culturally accepted. And that's why, like, if you look at even Texas, like especially the suburbs now and even some exurbs, they're slowly starting to turn pretty progressive, if not blue in some cases. And even the Republicans there.
Yeah, I was just about to say that. Yeah, the Republicans in a lot of these areas are actual progressives.
Yeah, and the country's just going further to the left. You have like a really nasty culture. Also, this is going to be controversial, but because of mass migration, look at research as well from third world countries, especially like Spanish-speaking countries. Majority of Hispanics, they're not very down with a lot of basic American civil liberties. And once these people get citizenship, they will very likely vote progressive, and best case scenario, you'll just see a GOP become more progressive than it already is. Absolutely. Because you're just seeing a complete leftward shift. And yeah, man, there are big macro factors now that people are not taking into account that show that we're not really going on a good path. But I do think that there are some opportunities through decentralization and nullification that can counteract that.
Yeah, most definitely. I'm right there with you. This is why I'm such a proponent of some sort of decentralization. Anytime somebody gets to talking about secession, I'm always front line like, hey, man, let's get to it. Because I think really that, I mean, I honestly think that may be our only choice here, realistically speaking, is to break it up and then attack it in that way, shape, or form, because just looking at it, and it's so massive, the federal government just continues to get bigger, continues to get stronger, and that the stronger that it does get, the harder that it becomes to fight. So most definitely, when you consider that influence, it's my honest opinion that secession and decentralist sort of movements are going to be the way to go if we're going to legitimately combat it. It's just because I don't think that the war is going to be won necessarily in government, if that makes any sort of sense. And this is why it's not just decentralization from, let's say, Texas seceding. It's decentralization in a lot of different elements. Education is a big thing with myself. I mean, I think these public school systems are rotten, and I think federal government, their involvement in it just does nothing but sort of escalate that problem. So trying to get them out is a way to sort of decentralize, and I think that will help sort of the populace, because they're rotten. They're rotten from generally top to bottom, and the public schools at this point really, and their educators are nothing more than just extensions of the state. You know what I mean? And that they're it's a harsh word, but indoctrination, I think, is fair. It's fair when you consider what's taking place in those schools. And I do think that decentralization is a way, to certainly fight it. Well, again, Jose, I appreciate you joining us. You talked about, and this is the last thing I want to bring up. You talked about, ebooks that you put out. If you can, for us, sort of give some brief summaries of those ebooks, and as well as let everybody know where they can find your material.
Well, okay, the first ebook I dropped was the 10 Myths of Gun Control, and it's just a very basic rundown of like the common myths we hear in the media about like gun control and why we need it. But I also go out of my way to delve into some historical trends that we've seen and expose as well some of the weak defenses that we see from conservatives. I think this is the most non-PC take on gun rights in 2019. You can get that on my website at josealnino.com/10-myths-gun-control. Now, my second book was on Venezuela, how socialism destroyed Venezuela and why America should stay out. That's just basically a historical breakdown of the Venezuelan economic collapse. I go from its very foundations in the 19th century to the present to explain why it's at its current state. But I also position the book in a non-interventionist way to show that no matter what the U.S. does, whether it's subsidizing an opposition to rebel against the government or takes direct military action, the country is very likely going to be socialist for a while. So you can find that book also on my website, josealnino.com/how-socialism-destroyed-Venezuela.
Most definitely. I will have all of that information in the show notes, everything that we went through in today's show for Canon's sake. And again, I have all of Jose's links. You can. What is your Twitter handle so the people can follow you?
Jose Al Nino.
All right, at Jose El Nino, you can check that out. And all that information will be there. Again, Jose, I appreciate you joining us. We're going to have you certainly on the show. You're certainly a great resource in terms of picking your brain about things that we hear in the media and they're talked about, but not really in depth. And you just gave a lot of people, I believe, certainly with the Venezuelan crisis, you've given them a lot of insight. So I do appreciate you coming on, man. Most definitely, we'll do it again.
That's going to do it for today's episode of For Canon's Sake with Eric July. Be sure to keep it locked for the best mix of comics and political commentary you'll ever hear. And I mean ever hear. To get caught up or to contact the show, be sure to visit forcanonsake.com.